What's going on, everybody? Hotep to the family, Ashe to all my people out there. Welcome to another episode of My Unapologetic Perspective here on the Mighty Motivation Network, where we give our point of view of controversial topics from experience, history, and knowledge as African Americans. I'm here with my co-host. To the right of me is Shaquan Battle. To the right of him is Jerome Battle. We apologize for our absence for the last couple of weeks, but some holidays fell. Some important things happened to where we had to take a vacation. But we're back, we're refreshed, and we're here to give out more Black history and more information.
And that holiday was not July 4th.
Absolutely not.
It was not. It was not.
We didn't pop off no fireworks.
Nah.
We really did. We really did. But we had a great time on Juneteenth.
We did.
We had a get together. That's probably going to be annually for my family. I seen a lot of good things happening. Appomattox, Roanoke had great events for Juneteenth. Wish I had a round of applause. Great job, Black people going out there and really representing our culture and our history. So before we get started today on the topic, I want to get y'all take on first couple of current events. Since we've been gone, a couple of things have happened. Number one, Derek Chauvin sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison. Not the maximum, not what was recommended, just a little bit more.
Start. You got to start somewhere.
Got to start somewhere. Okay.
You got to start somewhere. I mean, at the beginning, we wanted them to be charged. There have been quite a few of these incidents where officers didn't even get charged.
Yeah.
And then there were some where officers got charged, but they didn't get found guilty.
Mm-hmm.
We had instances where they had grand juries, and the grand jury wouldn't indict.
Mm-hmm.
So we got the charge, we got the arrest, we got the conviction, and we got the sentence.
We got all of it.
The one thing is you can't ask for certain things and then complain about how little you got after you asked for, right? We asked for it. We got it. We got 22 and a half. The other thing is justice or not, it's not going to change the fact that we got to continue to have these type of things happen on the other side. So we got to continue to have officers being held accountable. We got to continue having prosecutors prosecute them. And we got to continue having juries that understand that there is diversity and there's inequality and injustice in the way that these officers are conducting their business.
Absolutely.
We have to have that. So it has to continue. So it's a start.
Shaquan.
Firm believer in small progress is still progress.
Okay.
Like I said, they're not going to please everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So I was content with what we got versus what we used to get.
That's right.
So I'll take that. It's a start, and like Dad said, it's a start, but we can't stop.
Absolutely. Do y'all think pending charges weighed into his decision? Because there's talks about something else is coming for him.
Yeah, from a previous case, I think that could have had some bearing. But really and truly, I heard a couple of jurors say that you watched the video.
Yeah.
You watch the video, and I know there's been a lot of video about a lot of other incidents where we think that should be it, and it's not. But in this case, a lot of jurors felt like the video was compelling enough to say, yeah. Case in point, one of the jurors said that the way that he was posturing when he had his knee on George Floyd's neck showed that George Floyd was not a threat.
Right.
So you don't put your hands on your hip when you have a threat. So that alone told them that he was not a threat. So there was no defense for that. So you have jurors that are really looking at the evidence. And it's not politics. Which in most cases it usually is. In this case, it wasn't politics. They looked at the evidence.
I think another thing that hurt was actually his mother's testimony. His mother talked about grief for her son, but she never once mentioned grief for the family of the deceased. I think that hurt. Of course, Derek Chauvin asked to say anything, and he chose to not talk about it, being that there are other cases coming up that possibly could have hurt him. But I think the judge did what he felt was fair and right. So I don't think the judge really pleased anybody. He went with the medium. So if he would have gave the maximum sentence, it would have been an outrage. If he would have gave the minimum sentence, it would have been an outrage. He went with the medium to where, okay, both sides can hate me, but, justice was served in some form of way.
Again, the judge even said the conviction was the most important thing.
Right.
Yeah. So the conviction is what they really want.
Right. My only problem was, y'all know, I know drug dealers that got double that time.
Oh, absolutely.
So again, the system is still broken. I know people who are doing twice that time for a drug that is no longer illegal.
Right.
So, which leads into talking about illegal substances. So with weed, Ms. Richardson, y'all thoughts?
My take is going to be a little bit different. And I know a lot of people will dislike what I'm saying. I understand that, a lot of people say, well, Jerome, you don't smoke. So, we know where you stand. My problem is, one, I don't agree with the legalization of it because I think it's for the wrong reasons.
Right.
People can talk about it doesn't have permanent effects on individuals that smoke weed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's say it doesn't. I could care less. At the end of the day, it's something that your kids are going to grow up and want to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like driving. It's just like smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, sex. Something that kids look forward to. Add another one to the list.
Mm-hmm.
They did the same thing with alcohol with the prohibition. But it's all about money. See, so when they legalized alcohol again, it wasn't because they thought it was okay. It's money.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to get the money that the bootleggers would get it.
Mm-hmm.
So they regulated it so they could get the money. Weed's no different.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, they could care less about whether it fries your brain or not,
Mm-hmm.
or how it affects you on your job or in your personal life, whether it endangers people. I remember in the 80s, they wanted to legalize weed. There was an Amtrak train accident where the conductor said that he smoked weed right before the accident. That's one of the reasons why it wasn't legalized prior.
Mm-hmm.
But it does have effects. So what you're going to have is, just for those that don't know, a DUI is driving under the influence,
Mm-hmm.
which means you can get a DUI from smoking weed. It's going to go through the roof. One of the leading killers in the United States right now is alcohol.
Right.
Then you add another one to the mix.
Yeah.
So with this Olympic runner, I understand that she was going through some things in her personal life. A lot of pressure on her, and smoking weed is a way to relax. However, it is against the rules.
Yeah.
So what's ahead of you.
She owned up to that, though. She owned up to that and said she knew what the rules were. She still
I
made
get
her
what
choice.
people say that, it's legal now.
Mhm.
Okay, it's still against the rules. And just for those that don't know, don't go down to your job this week high up thinking that because it's legal, it's all good.
Right.
It's not.
Right.
So just keep that in mind. And she had to learn the hard way. And I hope other people learn from her mistake.
Shaquan.
Much like you said, episode 1, the laws is old. Well, these rules are old. You look at Michael Phelps, 2 years back, drug problem, still got to swim.
Mm-hmm.
My man that wowed out, I forgot what his name was. He was a swimmer too. I forgot his name.
Yeah, I know you're talking about.
Still got to swim.
Mm-hmm.
But now,
Was it Locke or something like that?
yeah, I think that's what it was. Then you get this black girl with the long nails, the weave, the color weave.
Yeah.
She's flamboyant. When she's running, she's pointing at the clock, so she's showing people up. And to me, it's almost like we have to find something to bring her down. Now, granted, she admitted to her wrongdoing, but at the same time, let the girl run.
Right.
I'm sure it's a lot of people that probably tested positive for marijuana, but because who she is and what she's done over the past few months, I felt like they kind of targeted her.
Absolutely. Since y'all took two different avenues, and I agree with you both, I don't think there's a right and wrong answer in that question I asked. But I think both of y'all know where I stand. I've talked about this before when it comes to Black influence. I'll pose the question to you, Shaquan. Why do people run in the Olympics or participate in the Olympics? What do you think is the number one reason?
Well, the obvious is to get the gold medal.
To get the gold medal,
Right.
okay? And I think it's safe to say that running for your country, which whatever the way you deem that to be, right? Some, take pride in it. Some just say, I still want to represent, even though I don't agree with most things that goes on in America. So, we, raise our fists during the gold medal ceremony. We speak out. We know that for a fact, all through history, that the most dominant athlete in the world is the black athlete. We agree. We know that the most influential person in the world is the black man and black woman, right? So my question again is, why do we need the Olympics? The same question I would ask, you go deeper, why do we need the NBA? Why do we need the NFL? We know what Negro League Baseball did and the things that it changed by creating it itself its own. But when you have, if all of the athletes that spoke up for this black woman, if they really wanted to make change, they could, if they really wanted to.
That's right.
Could you imagine if every black athlete from the United States said,
I'm not going.
we're not coming. If she don't get the run, we ain't coming. You know what Tokyo would say? We losing money.
Right.
Because, for instance, we're not watching all of these events. We're going to look up Richardson. What time is she running? We're watching her. We're going to look up the USA basketball team. What time are they playing? We're there. We're going to look up the other female runners. We're going to look up the black swimmers. We're going to look up Simone Biles, the whole black gymnastics team now. We're looking up all of them. And black people are not just doing that. The rest of the world is doing that. Ask some of these people from other countries, who is such and such that's running for Tokyo? Who is such and such that's running for, what you call them? They're going to name American athletes, Jamaican athletes, Haitian athletes. You're going to be talking about mostly black athletes. Why do we need the Olympics?
Right.
So if we really want to make real change, we didn't need tweets. We didn't need Facebook posts. We didn't need media outrage. It was simple saying, we're not coming. Because what is the benefit? When you look up the history of the Olympics, most of the time you're going to now find out who won the gold medal. Now, we talk about Wilma Rudolph and Jesse Owens. Of course, those are names that just blew us out the water. But when you look up the history of it, they're going to just say gold medal, United States of America. They're not going to say who came in second place during Jesse Owens' run. Most people don't know. So when you ask about what are we doing? Black people have to become unified to understand that we are the dominant culture, society, influencers, to say that we can start saying no to protect the interests of black people. And what Malcolm X said, there's going to come a time when a black man is going to think like a black man. And when you go against that one black man, you're going to go against all the black people. And until we get that unity, they can still dib and dab on what we can and we can't do. They just came out with for the swimmers that they care were the black-owned haircut. Does it make you swim faster? They told Simone Biles that she can't do certain moves because she's too advanced. Wait a minute, what? I'm too good?
I still think that at the end of the day, it is going to be incumbent upon Black America to understand the rules aren't for you.
Right.
So we talked about this on the podcast previously on several of them, is that we have to be better than our counterparts. You can't just be good for a black person.
Yeah. Right.
You got to be better than the counterpart. That's just not in the performance. That's in the conduct. That's in the decision. So I get the fact that when you look at this, obviously, we look at the comparison of how others were treated in the past. Well, one, if you remember, the rules aren't for you.
Right.
So you have to know that. Two, the whole purpose in going to the Olympics is showcase your talent.
Right.
We know when you play things or do things at a high level, you want to do it showcasing on the biggest platform. Right. For these track, especially for track and field. This is it.
This is it. Right.
So this is something that most people prepare for their entire lives.
Right.
So obviously to be able to go do it on the big stage is what you want. I remember when you play basketball and it was something the coach said and you didn't particularly care for the play that he called or whatever. And I told you, I said, your objective is to do what? Be on the floor.
Right.
To be, that coach tell you, when you get the ball, I want you to do this. Yes, sir. When you get in the game, you get the ball, you do what you want.
Yeah.
Right? But your objective is to be in the game. Her objective should have been to run. That's your objective. Whatever it takes. So yeah, okay, the rules don't apply to you. Got it. Then don't do anything wrong. Right?
Mhm.
So I understand that people are outraged, and then I think the girl that's replacing her is a white girl. So I think that's what people look at. For sometimes everything is not black and white; it is color.
Right.
Okay, but the color starts with you. What did you do? What did you contribute to the situation?
Because we understand that the rules aren't
Absolutely.
we understand.
Absolutely.
And she knew that.
Right.
So the responsibility is more on her than it is anybody else.
And she owned up to it.
Yeah.
So I wish I had a round of applause for her. And that just makes me appreciate, shout out to her, this makes me appreciate Simone Biles even more.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
It just makes me appreciate her even more for what she's, especially from doing a competition that is not particularly for black people.
Right.
When we think about it, we know track and field we dominate,
right.
but gymnastics is not something that we've dominated in the past, but it is now.
And Gabby Douglas.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's right.
Absolutely.
But shout out to Nike for, still backing. Still backing her.
Absolutely. I mean,
Well, we know what Nike.
we know what it's about. But we would prefer that other black athletes learn from this.
Yeah.
And not just athletes, blacks in general.
Right.
So if you know somebody on your job, they get hired on a regular basis and still got their job and was never suspended, it don't mean you can smoke weed and go to work.
Right.
It don't apply to you. Think about it.
I mean, you look at Marion Jones. You look at, what she did. The rules wasn't for her.
It's better to go in and accept that and figure out a way to overcome it than to learn the hard way.
Yeah.
We're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. And we are back. Again, head to YouTube. Subscribe to the YouTube channel under the Mighty Motivation Network. We thank everybody who's been rocking with us, subscribing to the channel, commenting, sharing. We appreciate you. So today we're going to get into our topic. Today we will be talking about the Harlem Renaissance. We want to get into what led up to it. We want to get into the impact that it had. And of course, we're going to talk about how it affects us today. But again, y'all know what time it is. It's the segment of going through a chronology of history. And a lot of that, which we had already talked about before on this podcast, you're going to hear a lot of repeated things. But even if you hear repeated things and you tune into this every week, you should be a guru. And in this area, whenever people talk to you about what's going on, you should have that embedded in your mind. But what led to the Harlem Renaissance? We're going to start at the Great Migration. Again, the Great Migration after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, white supremacy began to become on the rise, especially in the late 1870s, when Jim Crow was placed into the law of the land. Also, you had Southern black people who had to abide by what they called the black codes that we talked about previously on this podcast. We talked about sharecropping system. Even in the last episode, we talked about the sharecropping system, how they were making little to no money sometimes working the old plantations. And then you also had the epidemic in 1898 that caused massive crop damage across the South. Which led a lot of people to what we call the Great Migration into larger cities like we see Chicago, like we see Detroit, St. Louis, like we see D.C., Maryland, the D.C. area, New York, and California, we Kansas City, those type of places. But Southern people, black people were also moved because the movie Birth of a Nation that you talked about on this podcast before came out, and the numbers for the KKK went very high. And also we saw the number of lynchings that were happening in the South. So a lot of black people were trying to get away from that Southern fear and move north. And also it was better opportunity in the North at the time. You can make 3 times more by working in the factory, especially with the World War I about to start. People were looking for workers in the factory. So the Great Migration, of course, and you had people moving into New York City, as we talked about. But when you look at the history of Harlem was mainly an all-white neighborhood.
1910.
Yeah, it was predominantly white. But one of the things that ended up happening was the real estate bubble burst in 1904, 1905, where a lot of white property owners had vacancies because a lot of people were waiting on the subway to be finished in Harlem so they could begin to move into certain places in New York at a rapid pace. But when the subway was taking too long, they were losing money. So they ended up starting to rent out and selling some property to black people. And of course, when one black person moved in, a lot of white people move out. They didn't want to live with black people at the time. They did pass the civil rights bill that we talked about, the housing bill that made it illegal to discriminate against black people for housing. But we know that there were codes put in place to where people were not supposed to sell to black people or rent out to black people, especially in predominantly white neighborhoods. But Harlem was losing so much money that it began to do that. And a lot of elite black people moved into these areas because they could afford to pay the rent and all this other stuff. A lot of churches ended up buying a lot of property and moving black people out of Hell's Kitchen into Harlem. And black people also, they had their own realtor company called Afro-American Realty Company in 1904, in which they went in and bought a lot of property and moved black people into where we got where Harlem became a predominantly black location.
Yeah, by 1950, 97% black.
Absolutely. So
over 40 years, a little more than 40 years, it went from being predominantly white to predominantly black.
Mm-hmm. So we had the Great Migration, and then we have the flow of black people moving into the areas that now we call Harlem. And that's what started what we call the Harlem Renaissance. But what ended up happening was, so people asked, what was the Harlem Renaissance in particular? Did you guys have any comments on it?
Before they even termed it that, it was called the New Negro
Movement. Yep.
And obviously, when we talk about the migration, yes, for better work opportunities, but at the same time, racism in the South was systematic, was very institutionalized. So in order to escape it, you couldn't just live in your own community and be to yourself. You had to leave that state.
Mm-hmm.
It was racism was very strong in the South. In the late, even after, just so people will understand, even after the Civil War, racism still existed. So the war didn't end racism; it supposedly ended slavery.
Right.
So you had this migration, the Great Migration, where you had, there's to the tune of 1.6 million blacks moving to the North and to the Midwest, all at one time. So this was going on, and Harlem comes to mind for the same reason that you just talked about, something we talked about on an earlier podcast. Malcolm X used to say this all the time. You can blame white America for traffic jams. Because what happened is you wanted to segregate us. You wanted to have us living in one area, but you wanted to employ us in another area. How are we going to get to work?
Yeah.
So you created this traffic jam, and then you had to come up with a solution, which is where you got public transportation from. So, of course, they were building the subway for that reason in New York City. So a lot of things took place and formed what you currently have today when you look at these, what we call metropolitan cities.
It was in between the 1910 and 1920, the black population of Northern grew. For New York, it was 66%. Chicago was 148%.
That's right.
Philadelphia was 500%, and Detroit was 611. And if you look at like these places now, and you try to figure out why they predominantly black, doing this research, I could never figure out why. People from New York be like, yeah, I got family down south. This all made sense.
Right.
This brought it home for me.
Right, because everybody essentially came from those southern plantations a lot and ended up moving. Which you can still, if you listen to a lot of city people talk, they still have that country genre sometimes that are like, okay, we know you got family from the South. Nas did a episode of Finding His Roots, and he talked about how his mother's cooking. Some things his mother would say, you could tell that she wasn't from New York. You could tell that she was from the South. But a lot of people ask, what was the Harlem Renaissance?
One more thing before you get into that. And I want y'all to expound more on it too. The Lost Cause Act. it claimed that slaves was happy, that they was happy and content with working on plantations, and it was good for everybody that way. This led to some Southerners to believe that blacks were ungrateful. Now, I never heard or knew about the Lost Cause Act until I started Googling this.
That's what happens when white America speaks for black America.
Sounds like Uncle Ruckus with the Boondocks to me.
That's what happened is, they spoke on behalf of the slaves. It's kind of like what we see today when the news speaks for the black community. But the news reporter and the news network doesn't represent the black community.
Right.
Same thing.
Yeah, when you look at the South anyway, this is the South like to think that they had a way of dealing with blacks. They thought that they understood blacks and that this is
Best for you.
this is what was best for black people. So again, nothing's changed.
Yeah.
Nothing's changed.
And to answer your question,
Now it's just called the media.
Yeah, that's right. About Harlem Renaissance was basically an African American cultural, social, and artistic movement. Because as you said earlier, we are the most artistic and gifted people in the world.
Right.
There's no question about that. And the Harlem Renaissance was an opportunity, since you're bringing, as we talked about before the podcast, you're bringing this melting pot. You have this melting pot of different cultures of black people coming together.
Right.
See, people believe that when we all came from Africa, we all spoke the same language, we're all from the same tribe, we all lived in it. None of that's true. So we all came here, and there were different tribes, different cultures, different traditions. And you take all these people after slavery, and you put them all in the North and in the Midwest, and they all come together, and you have all these people wearing different clothing, drawing different pictures, painting different pictures, singing different songs, playing different music. And you put them all there together, they say, you know what, we need to bring this together so we can start documenting all this stuff. And that's where you get the Harlem Renaissance.
And I believe the spark came from W.E.B. Du Bois, from the book, The Souls of Black Folk.
That's right.
I think that's it right there.
It is.
Yeah, The Souls of Black Folk, which came in 1903. And he says, like you just talked about, he says, diverse cultures should develop side by side in harmony rather than be melted together or ranked on the scale of evolving civilization. So what ended up happening was, like Pops just talked about, was you had these different black people come together from different cultures, different traditions, different rituals that basically formed under one umbrella and created what we consider black culture as one.
That's right.
So you had African Americans from different places, whether you were from Kansas City, whether you were from Mississippi, whether you were from New Orleans, Jamaica,
That's right.
London. Everybody wanted to come into Harlem because they wanted to make Harlem the black Mecca. Of course, Atlanta was competing at the time, but they wanted to make Harlem the black Mecca altogether for African Americans.
And just the history of Harlem, before the colonizers, the area that was Harlem, which it was spelled with two A's originally, was inhabited by the Manhattans.
Yeah.
Which is where you get the word Manhattan from, which is a native tribe who belonged to other Native Americans, and I can't pronounce it, so I'm just going to spell it. It's Lenape. So before the colonizers, guess who was there?
For sure.
The Native Americans.
For sure. Of course. We're going to get into that a little bit on another episode when we get into terms like Black Wall Street.
And I didn't know that Harlem was predominantly occupied by Jewish and Italian Americans in the 19th century.
Well, yeah, and that just goes back to what we talked about. At one point it was just by because when you look at blacks, Irish, Italians, Jews are considered the lowest of any other white people, of other Europeans. So when Italians moved in, white people said, we don't want to live with them. So the Jews move in, the Italians said, we don't want to live with them. And then the Irish moved in, Oh, we don't want to live with them because if you listen, they would call Irish the white niggas.
Yeah.
They would call the Irish the white niggas. We don't want to live with them.
Same thing applies today.
And then when the blacks moved in, the Irish, we ain't staying here. But when you look at New York specifically, I know Dad could contest to this, is they still own the properties. So a lot of Jews still own property in New York. A lot of Italians, they lived there. They kept the property, they kept the businesses, and black people didn't live there.
That form of segregation that I keep talking about.
But absolutely. But yeah, of course, that's what the Harlem Renaissance was. It was a African-American culture manifesting in literature, music, stage performance, and art. So you had black painters, which they began to like paint African masks from different tribes of like the Congo, the Benin, the Senegal. They began to really find their African heritage and roots again. Because again, when you talk about Renaissance, the word Renaissance means a rebirth.
Absolutely, because we lost that.
We lost it, but we've been told all throughout history that black people don't have any history or culture.
Absolutely.
But you can't get the word Renaissance without having some type of heritage and culture to start with.
So let me ask you this. How was it for you when you first found, all of this, getting in touch with your ancestors and things like that?
I didn't want to believe it because our minds are trained to think one way, whether it's religion, whether it's traditions and heritage, what you were raised in the household. You know how hard it is to tell people, not white people, tell black people,
right,
where you come from, because you've been trained your whole life to believe a certain way, to think a certain way, to act a certain way, because black people still have this thing where we don't want to cause no trouble. When you think about it, Martin Luther King, before he died, he was the most hated man in the world. Not just by white people, black people hated him because they didn't want to cause no trouble. So it blew my mind, and I had to say, okay, everything that I've learned, I have to question. And of course, people make fun of the woke community. They say, well, everybody woke and y'all question everything. We have to. We have to because of what we was taught and who taught us. So we are going back and we are opening up our eyes and ears to everything. We're keeping an open mind about anything.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying? 100 years from now, people just thought the Egyptians was just all white. 100 years ago, people thought that black people were just slaves. When they came from Africa, they didn't speak a language. They couldn't read. They couldn't write. They were just inferior people.
Think about the amount of people just a couple years ago that celebrated the 4th of July that no longer celebrates the 4th of
July.
Exactly.
Me included.
Yeah.
What about for you, Dad? Like growing up in D.C.,
Actually, that's what led me to research the Harlem Renaissance. Actually, what happened is I went to New York to visit. I was probably 13 or 14 at the time.
First time.
And when I went to New York, you guys know I love to draw. So seeing graffiti for the first time, and I started doing research on graffiti, which led me to Harlem and led me to Harlem Renaissance. So, of course, we had encyclopedias. So for those that want to know how I found out. So when I got back to D.C., I started doing more research, and there was you guys hear us talk about Kelly Walker all the time, my next door neighbor. We had an older brother named Tony Walker. And Tony was very, very educated in a lot of things. And talking to Tony, I found out about the Washington, D.C. Renaissance that was, kind of came down from Harlem with some of the same major characters. And from that, you end up with what we have today, which is go-go music. So for me, it was interesting because I was into those kind of things. And of course, growing up in D.C., go-go music was our favorite music. And you always want to know, where did that come from? Well, without the Renaissance, you don't get that. So that was huge for me growing up as a kid. So when you came up with this topic, I was like, I lived this.
Right.
So I'm one of the rare people that was able to live an understanding of the Harlem Renaissance, the Washington, D.C. Renaissance. And if you ever have an opportunity to go to Chicago or Detroit, you'll see that same influence.
And I'll also say briefly, because this is our podcast, I can say whatever I understand. Understanding when we say that we are our ancestors, and African belief system, we believe that we have an encoded encyclopedia within us that we can activate if we understand our true knowledge, if it comes across. For instance, if somebody was to show you something that you did 30 years ago, and you would say, hey, yeah, I remember that. Of course you will remember you did it.
You did, right.
But you just had to be reminded that you did it. But if you came across a word, you came across a song, you come across a quote from a movie, you'll remember it because you watched it at one time. The same comes through the transition from our ancestors. They encoded this in us. So when you learn about stuff like African culture, you gravitate towards it, even though you may not know it, you know it. So this is what we believe in African culture, is that it's in us. We just have to find that nature of ourselves that once existed long ago. And when we find it, we gravitate toward it because it's a part of us. So it's not new information. It's just new to our own thinking in today's society that we learn about it. This is just coming from African concept. But not only did they have black painters, black books was the most important thing during this time. Well, one of the most important things, because you have black characters with black perspectives.
That's right.
They talked about racism. They talk about prejudice behind stories, folklore stories. The main thing that they did was with fictional stories and poetry was they rejected the traditional American standards of writing, utilizing their own style of writing to signify their own cultural identity. So the people that we're going to talk about did this in great ordeal. So they didn't, when you think of Shakespeare, they didn't talk like Shakespeare. They could, and if they did, they translated it into where black people will understand what they were talking about. So when you think about writers today, and me included, because I'm an author now, these people paved the way for me to write the way I talk. Because if you go through an English class, they tell you this is not the right way. This is not the correct grammar. This is not the way you start a sentence. This is not the way you end a sentence. This is not the way you start a paragraph. This is not the way you use quotations. When you talk about the African American specifically, those rules don't apply to us. So they created their own rules to become great writers within themselves without falling to the normalcy of what other writers were doing at the time. People like Zora Hurston, who I know Dad's going to get into later, she was called being too black.
That's right.
Her writings were too black. But many also promoted racial pride and embracing their African sentiment. Many works address feelings of alienation experienced by minorities in American society. And they also uplifted black people. Of course, on the last episode, we talked about black music, jazz and the blues, race records. All of those things were monumental for the Harlem Renaissance, especially when you talk about Broadway musicals, because it led writers like the ones that were writing poetry and musicians to come together and do Broadway shows that led to, the stardom of people like Josephine Baker. Most people even contribute the start of the Harlem Renaissance to an actual play called Shuffle Along. Shuffle Along was one of the first black Broadway musicals that had a sophisticated African-American love story that was pretty monumental for a lot of writers, actors, dancers, singers. And we own black clubs. Of course, you haven't been to that Cotton Club many a time. But Cotton Club, for a long time, was they didn't allow black people to be in there unless you were entertaining.
That's right.
So black people own their own clubs like Lenox Club, the Plantation Inn, the Savoy Ballroom, and then you have places like the Apollo Theater that began to give black people the opportunity to showcase their amateur talent. So anything else on that while we...
No, you're good.
We're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. And we are back. Again, subscribe on the YouTube channel, Mighty Motivation Network. Thank y'all for all y'all support and love, and we're going to dive right back in. So a lot of people may ask, what was the purpose? What was the purpose of the Harlem Renaissance? Why did we need it? What was the purpose of it? What did it achieve? We're gonna get into that real quick. So when I think about the Harlem Renaissance, and this is from my perspective, when I feel like what the purpose. We hear throughout history, especially when you read about history, and they talk about whether you talk about African culture, whether you talk about Kemetic or Egyptian culture, Asian culture, whatever the case may be, in order to be considered an advanced civilization, you have to have culture. And if you didn't have culture, they didn't consider you a civilization at all. So African Americans, when were stripped of their culture once the minute they stepped on the plantation to where they had to create their own, which we did through music, dance, and expressions that we talked about on the previous episode. But W.E.B. Du Bois was always looking for ways for African Americans to be respected, not just by white America, but to respect themselves, to respect each other. Again, like Pop said, we spoke different languages because we came from different places. Even when you talk about America itself, when you think of people like Sojourner Truth, you know, she lived on a Dutch plantation.
Right.
You know, a lot of people spoke different languages. When you think of the Haitians, spoke French and Creole French. And so when you think of the different languages and different cultures that we came from, we had to have respect for each other, which we still do today. We still do today. But the number one way W.B. Du Bois wanted Black people to be respected, and one thing we need to do was, his number one thing was education. And we talked about that on the previous episode too. The second thing was that we talked about on the previous episode, joining the war. He thought if we go fight for our country, we'll gain the respect, not only for ourselves, but from white America. And the third thing he thought that we should do to gain respect was hive our own art and our own literature so we can be a civilized culture in America. And what it was going to do was raise the level of literacy based on our culture. It was going to uplift our race. It was going to open up social economic opportunities and develop racial pride. Be prideful in who you are. And that's what they essentially did through their writings, through their paintings, through their Broadway shows. Remember, we talked about this on the previous episode. A lot of the Broadway shows that Black people were doing, they were characters of minstrel shows, making fun of themselves, making fun of their heritage and culture. This changed everything. And we think of writers before the Renaissance, there were people who just escaped slavery and told their story most of the time.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying? So this was a different type of writing, different type of music, different type of entertainment, different type of art that we could be proud of. And what grew out of it was a couple of organizations that we talked about. The NAACP formed in 1909 and became active in Harlem in 1910. And another person who we're going to do a whole episode on one day is Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which started campaigning, especially in Harlem, about 1916. So when you just think about what it influenced, you're talking about.
That's right. It's all of those things, and then you can add to that. One, you can never do anything in America without generating one thing: revenue.
Absolutely.
So it got to be about money. So of course, this generated money. But to add to that, when you start educating people, because we talked about education being the equalizer, but you also have to build that culture, that background of giving people an understanding of where you came from and your value. Talked about that too. Showing people's value. And then from there, you get that one big word: hope. Hope that you can become more than what they said you were, and that they will accept you for that. So you have that hope. Once you have hope, because you have to have unity, all that, you get that unity, and then you develop that concept of hope, you can achieve a lot.
Right.
And the Harlem Renaissance gave us all those things. And then it spread from there, not just in America, but across the world. You know, so obviously, the African culture is something that people wanted. And what I mean by that, they were willing to spend money for it. They were willing to buy it. Not just Black, but whites as well. Europeans
Yeah.
were willing to buy that culture, a part of that culture.
Right, and you said it. You used the word unity, and one thing that got started was there was supposed to be a kind of a award show of 25 people, and they were going to be celebrating a black artist, and I think it was Locke and W. Du Bois said, if you're going to celebrate him, we should celebrate everybody.
That's right.
And what they ended up doing was they came together and they came up with their own column or magazine, and they put all of the poems in there.
That's right.
They put the images in there and said, this is all of us. And it hit.
Absolutely.
And people wanted more. And then also what ended up happening was a lot of these black artists couldn't get their work into white museums or stores.
Wasn't that called Fires?
Fires was one of them.
Mhm.
And what ended up happening was they would have contests to where black people could compete and win a cash prize if their art was chosen. And when they began to put these artworks into the thing, white people started buying them. They started liking them, so they started putting more in there. They started coming up with finding ways to put black artists into these places. So that was huge.
I could out of Langston Hughes, that's a Negro artist. We younger, I quote, we younger Negro artists who create now to intend express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. That sounds like this podcast. If white people are pleased, we're glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful and ugly too.
Yep.
The tom-tom cries and the tom-tom laughs.
Yep.
If colored people are pleased, we're glad. If they are not, their displeasure doesn't matter either. We will build our temples for tomorrow, strong as we know how, and we will stand on top of the mountain, free within ourselves.
Strong racial pride.
You know, when I was a kid, I used to always think that, it's just in my opinion, that Langston Hughes was the first civil rights leader. In my opinion, he was, to me, he was the first civil rights leader. And the reason I say that is not just some of the things that he said, it's the perspective. Because prior to him, I don't know if you guys ever heard of County Color. He was a popular black writer during that same period. But what he did is he wrote to appease European and white America, right? A lot of his stuff most black people couldn't fathom, right? Langston Hughes wrote in a manner very educated. Let's make that point.
Yeah.
Very educated guy, but he wrote in a manner that, like you talked about, in a manner that black people can understand it.
Yeah.
So he didn't use proper grammar all the time. Now he could. There are some writings where he did, but he wrote in a manner that anybody could read it and understand. Mainly black people, and he loved black people to the point that, for those that don't know, I also like to do what we call slam, which is poetic. It's just poetry recited. Langston Hughes was the one who created that. It was called jazz poetry.
Yeah, because he loved jazz.
Exactly. So he mixed jazz with poetry, and you got what we call today slam.
Say, baby.
You know, absolutely. So Negro was in vogue, is what he used to say.
Still do that?
Oh, absolutely. I will always do that.
Say, baby.
You just might not hear it, but I will always do that. That's like drawing to me. So I will always draw, and I will always do poetic recital.
Can I be? Oh yeah, absolutely. So it achieved a lot. Again, it gave us pride, and it gave us control over the black experience. Like we talked about a few minutes ago, that we wanted to be able to give our perspective from our own point of view without other people telling us what we like and what we don't like, what we should be doing. It also removed those negative stereotypes that we seen from the minstrel shows, that we seen from things like Uncle Tom's Cabin, those type of things, where we really, laughed about our own culture and heritage. Cartoons that we talked about on the Black Visual episode. But it laid the groundwork for consciousness. When we talk about brothers being conscious now, it's because of them, because they thought intellectually, they wrote intellectually. And when you do that, like Dad always talk about, read books, When you read books, you will become intellectual. So regardless of what the blues music was saying, regardless of what jazz music was saying, the writers were writing in books and people were reading. Black people were interested in learning and becoming smarter due to these people putting it down on paper, putting it on paper. Because when you listen to music, you're a lot of times you're just going off the rhythm. But when you read books, you're going off the words. You're going off the perspective. But the Harlem Renaissance, it attributed to so much for a nation as whole. We also talked about The Crisis was another one of those magazines. The Opportunity was another one. Then you talked about Fire as well. But it contributed to other renaissances. When you just think about the Harlem Renaissance, there were other renaissances happening simultaneously while this is going on. The one of them being Chicago, Black Renaissance that happened in the 1930s and up through the 1950s, where people like Louis Armstrong, Lorraine Hansberry, Margaret Walker, Richard Wright came out of, and then like Dad talked about earlier, you had the DC Renaissance happen simultaneously. You had the Detroit Renaissance. You had Black art movement that came years later, but you had a lot of things that it contributed to that led to what we consider now having that racial pride. Even when you look at Atlanta, Georgia, how Atlanta is that Mecca that we talk about, but the racial pride of what it contributed came from what we consider to be the Harlem Renaissance of the first Black Mecca that we like to call it. Did you have anything else on the DC Renaissance that you want to talk about while we're here?
No, we're gonna talk about Langston Hughes when we start getting.
Okay.
But Langston Hughes was huge in the DC.
We're about to get into some people right after this break. If y'all had anything on what it achieved or what its purpose was before we move it.
So that through my research,
some of the major high schools in Washington D.C. was named after people that were part of it, like Dunbar High School. You guys hear a lot. We're Georgetown fans, so and Maryland fans. A lot of the players that go to Maryland and Georgetown came from Dunbar High, which was named after a guy that was really prevalent in Washington.
We're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. And we are back. Again, subscribe on the YouTube channel, Mighty Motivation Network, comment, share, send a link to somebody that you know that can benefit from this information. So we're going to move right along. We're going to talk about some important people, important things of the Harlem Renaissance that you guys can go up and look up for yourselves, which we hope you do. If you listen to this episode, we hope you go back and research the things that we talked about. Don't just take our word for it. I'll let one of y'all start with people you want to talk about or things you want to talk about from the Harlem Renaissance.
Jean Thomas Kane, 1923, a unique fusion of fiction, poetry, and drama rooted in Toomer's experience as a teacher in Georgia. Toomer's masterpiece was followed within a few years by a cluster of novels exploring Black experiences and dilemmas of Black identity in a variety of modes from different angles.
Okay.
I'm gonna stay with Langston Hughes. This dude was phenomenal. Although he's best known for his poetry, he's often marked with what they call lyrical patterns. He also wrote novels like 1929, Nap Without Laughter, short stories like his 1934 collection, The Ways of White Folks. This guy had a way with words. In fact, I would like for people, we often ask you guys to do your due diligence, but I'm going to ask you guys to do me a huge favor. And it's only because over the last few years, especially when Donald Trump was running for president, you heard that Let America Be Great Again and all that good stuff, where Langston Hughes had a poem in 1936 called Let America Be America Again. And I like everybody to Google that and read that poem. It's something that when you read it, you're going to go, this was 1936, not yesterday? I think it's going to surprise some people the way that Black America thought about America back in 1936. Because we always like to talk about how do these things apply to us today. I want people, and I'll repeat it. Let America Be America Again by Langston Hughes, 1936. Just read it, and you'll see how things from 1936 applies to you today. Langston Hughes, one of the greatest Black poets, writers, civil rights leaders of our time.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna go with a guy by the name of James Johnson, who was actually a principal of a Black high school in Florida. He was a lawyer, a songwriter. He actually co-wrote the song "Lift Up Every Voice and Sing," which is we call the Black National Anthem. But he ended up moving to Harlem, and him and his brother wrote over 200 songs for Broadway musicals. He actually became one of the head of the NAACP, especially in the New York area, where he actually was one of the ones that organized the silent march in New York against racial violence. I think we talked about that on this podcast before, the silent march. But his autobiography of an ex-colored man was a big contribution to the Harlem Renaissance, where he says things like, "It's no disgrace to be Black, but often very inconvenient," which is 100% true. You know, when you think about, you want to have that racial pride, but when you think about living in white America, it's sometimes inconvenient to do so.
That's right.
But he also said another thing that I like this, but if the Negro is so distinctly inferior, it is a strange thing to me that it takes such tremendous effort on the part of white man to make him realize it and try to keep him in the same place into which inferior men naturally fall. And that comes to show a lot, because if a race or a person was inferior, you don't have to tell them.
That's right.
They're going to prove it to you. So what we've seen from white America is they constantly try to ridicule Black people and keep them in a position lower than them. When if that was true, you wouldn't have to stomp on them so long. If they weren't strong enough to pick themselves up, then your boot wouldn't be necessary to keep stomping on them.
Right. George, I can't pronounce that, so I'm just gonna spell it. Is Schuyler. Published Black No More, a satire about Americans' obsession with race. The book was controversial in part because he mocked African American leaders. It contained parodies of Marcus Garvey, NAACP, and the Tuskegee leaders. The reason I chose that one is because you look at comedy now and what it's done for Black writers, parodies, Dave Chappelle, all of those, and you look at what they took it and made it, and that's the reason why I chose that one, because you look at what he started and then you look at what parodies are now.
Absolutely. That's good stuff.
I'm gonna go Paul Laurence Dunbar. I just mentioned him. They named a high school after him in Washington, D.C., basically because of his achievements through the Harlem, Washington, D.C. Renaissance, which was a spinoff from the Harlem Renaissance. And the great thing about him is, few of them, the great things about him was he learned to read by listening to slave master read poetry. And at age 6, he started writing poetry. He was the only Black child at Central High School, and was a member of the debating society and editor of the school paper and president of the school's literary society. He was the only Black in the school. So, and again, we're talking 1872, so this was going on, for those that put it in perspective. If you do your timeline, do your chronological, we weren't quite out of that slave mentality yet after the Civil War. You still had slavery still happening in certain areas. And you had this guy that was doing great things in a predominantly white school. He moved to Washington, D.C. in 1898 and lived on U Street. And U Street, at some point, was called the Black Broadway. A lot of people don't know that. But U Street is where the D.C. Renaissance took place. And that's where all the museums are. You want to go learn about the D.C. Renaissance, go to U Street. and you will learn everything you need to know about the DC Renaissance.
Mhm.
So I'm going to go Paul Lawrence Dunbar.
I love it. I love it. That's great information. And I didn't even know about the DC Renaissance until I started digging into the Harlem Renaissance. So great information. I'm going with Rudolph Fisher. He was actually the first Harlem Renaissance writer to enter mainstream press. He was published in the Atlantic Monthly for a short story. But he wrote a novel called The Walls of Jericho in 1928. And it basically was a satire of class and color prejudice about things that were going on in Harlem. But what it did was it combined lower class Harlem and upper class Black Harlem together in one novel. And it talked about how African American men could get ahead in the urban North if they joined together to overcome mutual distrust bred by centuries of oppression. Something that we're still fighting today. But he said, one of the quotes from this book, he says that that's what we Negroes need: a business class, an economic backbone. What kind of a social structure can anybody have with nothing but the extremes, blue blacks on one end and doctors on the other? Nothing in between, no substance. Everybody wants to quit waiting tables and start writing prescriptions right away. And I love that because we still deal with that problem today. It's just in the form of quick money.
That's right.
Drug dealer. We like to go by the quote, rags to riches.
Right.
You know, everybody want to go from being completely broke to being completely rich without putting in the in-between work. This is one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of successful Black businesses, people who stick with it, because they don't want to go through that in-between.
Right.
They want to go from rags to riches very quickly. And what he was saying in this quote was, we need a in-between. We need process. We need progress in order to achieve the riches that we want. But we have to be able to come together, which is the elite Black people that have money, teach the people who don't have money, and we can come up with that in between, a middle class. We can have that middle class because those are the people who are essential as well.
That's right.
They want it quick or they don't want it at all.
Facts.
Walter White. The novel was called The Fire in the Flint in 1924. It was a story of Dr. Kenneth Harper, an African-American doctor and World War I veteran who moves back into his hometown in Georgia to open a clinic and practice medicine after graduating medical school. Dr. Harper, who is initially unwilling to be involved in racial tension in the town, eventually fights against the KKK after he's subjected to hostile racism from the white residents. I picked that one because like today, you have some people that say, "Oh, that's Black. I've never experienced racism."
Absolutely.
Now, whether they know it or not, they have experienced racism. So I picked that one because it's a lot of times those people that haven't experienced racism, they sit on the fence.
Mm-hmm.
Or they won't admit it.
Right.
They won't admit the
Yeah.
experience.
So I picked that one because it kind of ties into today.
Early on, you said that one of the aspects of the Harlem Renaissance was about education.
Mm-hmm.
We always talk about that being the equalizer. I'm gonna go with Alan Leroy Locke, and the reason I'm selecting him is because it coincides with what you're saying about the education aspect, which was the first thing you mentioned about the Harlem Renaissance was education.
Yes.
Educating our people about our people.
Mm-hmm.
Alan Locke was an American writer, philosopher, educator, patron of the arts. Just that alone, this guy was smart, right?
Mm-hmm.
In 1907, he was distinguished and known as the first African-American Rhodes Scholar. Locke became known as the philosophical architect. I mean, that alone, this guy was smart, right? He was even acknowledged as the dean of the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah,
Again,
absolutely.
letting you know that this was a very educational movement. Also, Reverend Martin Luther King in 1968 proclaimed, we're going to let our children know the only philosophers that lived with no Plato or Aristotle, but W.E.B. Du Bois and Alan Locke came through the universe. Here's the kicker. His writings were so at an intellectual level beyond most people. He actually would suggest that readers would read other people's writings first. Before you read, you're not going to understand my writings first. Read some of these other writings and then come back and read mine. His was just at a high level, was too much for most people to really understand. Very well-educated guy, just too sophisticated for most. One of the people that he would say you should really read was Zora Hurston. So that's he kind of put her on the map, like put her out in the forefront and said, hey, you really want to read some good writing, read her stuff, and then after you read her stuff, come back and read mine.
Absolutely. I'm going to go with Nella Larson, who wrote Quicksand. She was really big in not just capturing the prejudice and racial equality for Black people, but she also spoke about the problems that Black women faced. It's one of her quotes from Quicksand says, somewhere within her, in a deep recess, crouched discontent, she began to lose confidence in the fullness of her life. The glow began to fade from her conception of it. As the days multiplied, her need of something vaguely familiar, but which she could not put a name to and hold for a definite examination, become almost intolerable, she went through moments of overwhelming anguish. She felt shut in, trapped. And we talked about on this podcast the importance of Black women on the episode, how a lot of Black women felt alienated or neglected. And we know that they're the most neglected people in the world. And I believe her words brought attention to Black women and helped them through a lot of cases, what we would call mental health cases today, or relationship problems today, to really give them a strong voice. Nella Larson, Quicksand.
I'm gonna jump in with Zora.
I knew you was gonna get to it. Let's jump into Zora.
Hit Zora real quick. Zora was unique because she loved the South. Most of these people couldn't wait to get out of the South.
Yeah.
She loved the South. She came from a suburb in Orlando, Eatonville.
All black
town, the first in the country.
Yeah.
You know, and she loved it because it was the only place that she ever felt that she wasn't treated differently and she did not feel inferior. So she loved being amongst Black people because it allowed her to be herself, and it allowed her to not feel inferior. She sometimes felt inferior being around white people, or they made her feel inferior. She also was a really good friend of Langston Hughes.
Yes, she was.
And they collaborated on a play together. And she received a lot of recognition for a novel because of the play that she did with Langston Hughes. And she also began early on her investigations into voodoo culture.
Yes.
Which we talked about. We think that one of the reasons why you don't hear her name as much as you probably should is because of her take on voodoo culture and her talking and writing more about voodoo culture. This is also important too. She also wrote a book called The Last Congo, so The Last Black Congo. And it was a story about Cujo Lewis. And for those that don't know, Cujo Lewis is believed to be the last survivor of the final slave ship that brought Africans to America. So she wrote a story called Black Cargo, which talks exclusively about Cujo Lewis. So Zora Hurston was huge, not just in the Renaissance, but in Black writing in general. So whenever you read any type of literature from the early 19th century, 20th century, you're probably reading something that was either influenced by Zora or influenced by Langston Hughes.
I remember when I texted you and I asked you about reading some Black authors, and you was like, you need something from a woman's perspective.
Absolutely.
And you told me to read Their Eyes Was Watching God.
Yes.
And I was reading it, and I said, dang it, this is hard to read. And it was hard to read because she wrote exactly how she saw it.
That's right.
And like you talked about the South, her research, she would go down south to these towns where Black people were, and she would sit outside the store where they sat and told these folklore stories.
That's right.
And she would write it exactly how they told it. And the jargon and everything, like the slang, all of those words. But when you read her, it's hard to read the quotations. It's hard to read the words that she are making other people say. But right after she does that, she has a way to put it into an intellectual way so where Black people can understand it. And white authors said there is absolutely no way white people could wrote the stories that she wrote. Her stories were specifically had to be wrote by a Black person that understood Black people. And because her perspective, we call today slick talk, she would put that in there, flirting words, slang. She would be able to put those into her novels and be able to explain it by using context clues on what it is that they were talking about. And she was just a natural storyteller. They said whatever she would show up, she would just tell stories. Because in her childhood, she would just read stories about the alligator that crossed the river, those things. And she would tell those stories out loud. And she was just huge. But there's a few quotes I want to read from her since we brought her up. She says, if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it.
That's right.
In her book, Dust Tracks on the Road, she says, I am not tragically colored. There's no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all. I do not belong to the sobbing school of Negrohood who hold that nature somehow has given them a low-down dirty deal and whose feelings are all hurt about it. Even in the helter-skelter skirmish that is my life, I have seen that the world is to the strong regardless of a little pigmentation, more or less. No, I do not weep at the world. I am too busy sharpening my oyster knife. And I believe that's what this podcast is.
That's right.
Yes, we're talking about history or where Black people were done wrong, systematically done wrong. But we're not using that as an excuse to not sharpen our own knife to go get what is ours. So nobody's going to feel sorry for us. It's on us to work twice as hard if we have to, which we know that we have to make way and pave way for everybody else. And I thought that quote was huge by her. I'm going to talk about, let's see, James Van Der Zee, acting as the unofficial photographer of the era of what we call the Harlem Renaissance, in which he would just go by taking pictures of middle-class African-American families living in Harlem, civilians. He even captured pictures of people like Marcus Garvey, Bill Bojangles Robinson, different writers. But he not only documented the Harlem Renaissance, he also helped create it. And I wanted to choose him for a reason because my wife takes pictures. I've taken pictures with her sometimes. Everybody owns a phone where they can capture pictures. But photography is so important that people don't stop to understand how important it is.
Right.
And what James did was he didn't understand what he was doing, but he was capturing history as it was happening. And without somebody like him, we don't have those moments where we can go back and look at and really enjoy the past from the future perspective. And it all took for him just saying, hold on one second, say cheese, hold on one second, pause for a moment, let me capture this. Captured in real time to give us just doing the future on what we're doing with history, especially with this podcast. This is why we record it visually. Because we're capturing history in the making. We may not even know what we're doing, but our family get a chance to go back and look at this on video or through photos, and that's what he uniquely did. When you talk about the Harlem Renaissance, you can go to Google and type in Harlem Renaissance, and pictures are going to come up of sophisticated black people walking around Harlem because of him. And he didn't know what he was doing at the time.
That's right.
I had Aaron Douglas, but I see you got him too. You can sum that up better than me, so I'm gonna choose Meadow Warwick Fuller.
I was just gonna say Better World Peace.
She was a female sculptor. Her sculpture Ethiopia in 1921 was inspired by the period of pharaohs in ancient Egypt and is widely considered the first Pan-African American work of art.
I'm glad you mentioned that because that's something that we did not talk a lot about. Is the sculpting?
The sculpting.
Yeah, that was huge during the Harlem Renaissance.
Yes.
That was because that was a lost art for many years. And so to have that resurface and be reestablished on the Harlem Renaissance was huge. So I'm glad you mentioned it.
And she was also the protege of Auguste Rodin in Paris.
And there was another sculptor guy by the name of Richmond Barth. But when we look at sculpting, why is it so important? When you think of a sculpture, you think of a monument. You think of something that's going to outlast a generation or outlast somebody's lifetime. So when you sculpture somebody, especially a real person, you're putting them on a pedestal to say this person needs to be remembered even after his lifetime. And one of the sculptors that I looked up that created the black image of power. When you look at it, their shoulders are not slumped over. They're rotted back. They're put into perspective that sometimes a picture can't do its justice because it's hard to capture a picture and have the person looking right. So a sculptor or a painting would have somebody like a Booker T. Washington, if you look at his sculptures, look like a powerful human being to where you say, I want to know what this person did.
That's right. And that's where you get monuments from.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you don't typically have a monument of a picture, or even a painting. Monuments are usually sculptures.
We're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back because there's something Shaquan said I want to jump into. All right, and we're back, and we're going to jump right back in. But you mentioned the person that I want to talk about. I didn't want to dive into it too much because I wanted Dad to, because he told me a story a couple weeks ago. I kind of want him to dive into a little bit on the podcast. But Aaron Douglas helped cultivate the concept of New Negro through his illustrations. But what he would do was he would paint murals on side of buildings.
That's right.
And places, those painted murals. And we're starting to see them today a lot of in gentrified areas where they try to keep the urbanness of it by painting murals on the side of these buildings.
That's right.
But that led into what we call graffiti, and I want Dad to touch on that for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. He was the first one to take a wall and make it a canvas. I mean, when I was a kid, I would look at the wall and go, that is a nice piece of canvas. And I would draw the wall. Of course, you only did it once. But obviously, in New York, you start seeing canvases become almost anything that was white and clear. Subway trains, huge. And what some people looked at graffiti as being junk, garbage, messing up, somebody's property, we looked at it as art. Yeah. And it was amazing. And we would do anything we could to either be able to tag it or see it.
Yeah.
I mean, people would line up to try to catch some of these trains, especially the ones that would come from underneath the ground and be above ground, where you could actually see it above ground. That became like watching the sunrise. If you got to see that train when they had that fresh tag before somebody screwed it up and put spit on it or whatever, that was amazing, because to us that was art. And obviously the initial start of that started with the Renaissance.
Right. And we're starting to see it now, especially to pay tribute with the murals of Nipsey Hussle, Kobe Bryant,
George Floyd.
Yeah, we're starting to see the murals really come back. And again, with gentrification, we're starting to see white America really try to keep that urbanized look by allowing murals on the side of their buildings. There's actually one in Lynchburg. I think it's like a donut place where they got a mural on the side of.
That's right. I remember when I first came here. Actually, it was the summer that I was here, I believe. There was a teacher at the Bedford, it was the elementary school at the time. on the corner of Longwood. And it was the if you go down the stairs in the red building, go out the door to go to the cafeteria. People my age and a little bit younger probably remember like a castle and some knightsmen being drawn on the wall and all that. I did that. They came to me and was like, hey, you like to do graffiti. We want you to paint on the wall. Really? And I'm not going to get in trouble? So I got to paint on the wall of Beverly Elementary School, and it lasted for several years. You know, so obviously painting on the wall was something we originated, and it lasted. Actually, you got billboards from there. That was the first creation of billboards as we know it today, came from that era of the Renaissance. So, and real quick, I want to mention Frank Horn. A lot of people know his niece, Lena Horn. But Frank Horn was unique because you mentioned something a minute ago about everybody wants to proclaim their blackness. Sometimes it's just inconvenient to do so. In the past podcast, you guys heard me mention Eleanor Roosevelt, who was very influential in not only women's rights, but also in the civil rights movement. And she was the wife of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Frank Horn worked in the Black Cabinet as Assistant Director of Division of Negro Affairs, National Youth Administration, and he helped develop the Home Finance Agency and National Committee Against Discrimination in Housing. So some of the housing opportunities that came about in Harlem was due to this guy working for the president during the Harlem Renaissance. And in 1960, he actually wrote a poem called Harvest Straw. And I like for people to Google and go read that. It's pretty awesome. And you have a black guy who works with white America in the government system, and he's not shameful about being black and being proud of his heritage and wanting to fight for his people. Starting with housing, which is something that we still struggle with even today. So you had a guy during the Renaissance and way after the Renaissance that was working hand in hand with white America and telling them, you're wrong and I'm going to fight you. We can go eat lunch. We can eat lunch all day long, but at the end of the day, I want you to do something to help these people. Help my people.
Yeah.
He had a nonfiction book called The Black Verse. He also had one called The Negro Race. But one that I advise people, you ever have an opportunity to read, it's called Concerning White People. And it's really good. So it's nonfiction. Check it out. You know, check some of these things out that we're asking you guys to read. Because we don't want you to take our word for it.
No.
If you listen to the podcast, we're not on here to be right. We're just here to strike interest, conversation, discussion. And we hope you do your due diligence by going out and doing your own research.
Absolutely. I'm going to go with Alice Dunbar Nelson real quick, give us each day. And she says, in every race, in every nation, and in every clime, in every period of history, there is always an eager-eyed group of youthful patriots who seriously set themselves to right the wrongs done to their race or nation, art or self-expression. I believe we see that today still with the younger generation still talking about history because we're righting the wrongs of things that was done to our ancestors. And like the shirt says, we are not our ancestors. You can guess these hands.
That's right. That's right.
Claude McKay's sonnet, If We Must Die. Claude McKay is important because he was Jamaican. And when he came to the States, he got a culture shock. He really didn't know how this stuff was still happening in the States. He's like, wait a minute, slavery over. What these people still treat y'all like this for? So he became real big into political resistance. And he wrote in If We Must Die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our cursed lot. So he was telling people that, you know, if oppressed people to resist the oppressors. We're not going to live on our knees. If we die, we're going to die in the struggle. We're going to die fighting back. And those were some type of things that were put into literature to, again, you had writers that'll make you laugh, writers that'll make you cry, writers that bring you consciously aware, politically aware, socially aware of what was going on. So you had a lot of different groups of writers that were doing important things. And that's what's great about Langston, because Langston did all of them.
He did all of
He
them.
did all of them.
Right. You have people like Duke Ellison and Pearl Bailey.
Yeah. And also, we talked about this on a previous episode when we talked about sports, with Negro League baseball announcers and writers came right out of Harlem Renaissance.
That's right.
When you think of people like Stuart Scott, Stephen A. Smith, the things that they say, the slang words that they use, and they got this from Negro League baseball, and this came right out of the Harlem Renaissance by using that slang and genre that necessarily wasn't correct grammar, but you say it and you create what we look at commentary today. That's when you hear bang, when another player hit a 3-pointer, that bang, it hits you because that comes right out of that spoken word and poetry about
Mark
people.
Jackson, hand down man.
Yeah,
Or mama, there goes that man.
That's right. I want to mention real quick too, Gwendolyn Bennett, and I want to mention her for a couple of reasons. One, you mentioned the magazine Fire, but also she was one of the first Black writers to write about interracial relationships. She had a short story called Wedding Day, and where she actually talks about gender, race, and what they call class dynamics in interracial relationships. So I think that was, especially nowadays where some generations don't see race, but just because you don't see it in your relationship don't mean that others don't see it. And the trials and tribulations that interracial relationships go through from both sides. And we're not just talking about how white America doesn't necessarily accept that. There's times where Black America doesn't accept it either.
Yeah. Closing remarks. You know, when we talk, we did this episode to let you see how self-expression today, where it comes from. When you talk about things that I do, motivational speaker, activism. You know, whenever you hear when somebody is killed unjustly, you see these great soliloquies given out about racial injustice, their poems, their spoken words. This comes right out of the Harlem Renaissance of self-expression through music. When we talked about last week, the music that came out of soul music, race records, things where they begin to talk about racial discrimination, songs like What's Going On, songs like with Sam Cooke, A Change Is Gonna Come, Donny Hathaway, Someday We'll All Be Free. All of these are poetically spoken. And when you look at music, rappers today, when you think of people like Mos Def, Talib Kweli, Common, KRS-One, Rakim, Public Enemy. You know, when you think about when you talk, especially Nas, when you think about these poetic rappers that talk about their self-expression, they can make you laugh, they can make you cry, they can make you think. This comes right out of the Harlem Renaissance of that expounded. So when we think about the Harlem Renaissance, there's no time period where it started. There's no time period where it actually ended because it was still going on today. It's just not calling the Harlem Renaissance. It's just the rebirth of Black people, whether that's religiously, whether you are a Christian or a Muslim or you practice African spirituality, Black Hebrew Israelite, 5%er, whatever the case may be. You're opening up your mind to different concepts from what you were taught. Because you're not going to learn a lot of this stuff in your own household. You're going to grow up one way and you're going to stick with that. But you're starting to see these expressions through music. I know a lot of people hate bringing up council culture, but these are just people who are going back researching things and say, wait a minute, why are we celebrating this?
That's right.
Not only that, but going back and looking at things were done wrong and, you know, bringing it down to the present, saying, yo, I don't care how long ago it was, this was wrong.
Right, absolutely. So you're seeing Black people become consciously aware, and they said the biggest threat to America is Black people unifying and Black people becoming intellectually active for themselves, thinking like a Black man, thinking like a Black woman.
Absolutely. When I think of the Renaissance, that's exactly what I think about is the unity. Then the awareness.
Yeah.
Because without awareness, without the unity, you don't get the education.
Yeah.
Okay. You don't get the hope. And obviously with the Renaissance, it's something that unique take on that is that as a kid, you always want to know where you got certain things from, certain features. You see people, oh yeah, he looks just like his dad, or he looks just like his mom. Features. Where you, as Eddie Griffin say, where you get your shit from? You know, everybody wants to know where they get their looks from, where I get my walk from, where do I get my talk from, where do I get my swag from. Everybody wants to know that. Well, for Black America, you get the Renaissance shows you where you get that from. So when you look at fashion, when you listen to music, when you listen to jazz, when you listen to the different types of jazz, when you see or hear the different dialects, the different slang, the different styles, the way you wear your hat, the way you tie your shoes. I think it's a unique thing. I watched you lace JC shoes one day and how you make the strings go the same way I make my strings go. Well, a lot of our strings go the way that they went during the Harlem Renaissance, because they have made us aware of where we came from. They made us aware of our culture. They educated us. They empowered us. They gave us that value that we were looking for as Black people.
And I'll just close with this. You know, it gave opportunities for people like us.
That's right.
To, number one, do this podcast and be able to speak the way that we speak and talk the way that we talk. To have our own media outlet platform without sounding like the normal CNN, normal MSNBC, those type of things. Me as an author, not being a writer, knowing all of, not getting a degree in English and all this stuff, allowed me the opportunity to write a book based off the way that I seen things, based off the way that I talk, the way that I understand things. And as a motivational speaker, it allows me, I don't have to sound like Les Brown and talk all proper. I could go out there, I can start with, hey, yo, and I can talk the way that I talk. And that comes right out of Harlem Renaissance.
For me, you know, Dad is into art. You know, he's into Photoshop, which in turn made me into